Imagine a nation bound by wires, every voice, every connection, every whisper of news, flowing through a single, colossal entity. This was AT&T, the Bell system. For over a century, it wasn't merely a company, it was the very nervous system of America, a monolithic symbol of progress, stability, and almost unimaginable power. Its grip was absolute, its reach unparalleled, woven into the fabric of daily life from the smallest farmstead to the bustling heart of Wall Street. Established in 1885, its dominion seemed as eternal as the nation it served, a seemingly unshakable bedrock of the industrial age, its influence reaching into every home and business across the continent through its vast network of copper and, later, fiber optic cables. Born from the spark of invention, AT&T cultivated a legendary research arm, Bell Labs. This was no ordinary corporate laboratory, it was a hallowed ground where the transistor, the laser, the photovoltaic cell, and the very foundations of the digital age were forged in fire and intellect. From its inception in 1925, it was a relentless crucible of innovation, a testament to the profound power of sustained, unfettered investment in pure discovery, pouring billions into the pursuit of knowledge. Bell Labs was not just an engine room, it was the intellectual genesis of tomorrow, birthing technologies that would redefine the world, including the fundamental principles of radio astronomy and the very concepts that powered early computing. But with such absolute dominion came a subtle, creeping arrogance, a belief in its own invincibility, a corporate culture that often prioritized control over collaboration. The world, however, was changing at an unprecedented pace. The digital revolution was not merely dawning, it was erupting, driven not by AT&T's carefully controlled roadmap, but by new, agile players operating on entirely different principles, their innovations often born in garages and university labs. Yet, the Titan saw not disruptive forces, but merely new territories to absorb, new markets to conquer, new acquisitions to swallow whole, reinforcing its own unassailable position, a strategy that would soon prove its undoing. The grand ambition, the ultimate prize, was to seize control of the nascent, burgeoning computer industry. A colossal acquisition was conceived in the early 1980s, a move that would fundamentally reshape the entire technological landscape of the late 20th century. The target, Digital Equipment Corporation, or December, a revolutionary company whose very existence, with its open architecture and disruptive software, challenged AT&T's established, vertically integrated order. This was not merely a business deal, it was a gamble of unprecedented scale, a bid to own the future itself for an astronomical sum, potentially tens of billions of dollars, a sum that would dwarf most national economies. The government, however, had been watching. For years, the sheer, unassailable power AT&T wielded, the absolute monopoly it had meticulously cultivated and defended since its founding, had been a source of growing concern. The Department of Justice had already filed antitrust lawsuits against the company multiple times throughout the 20th century, the most significant being the suit initiated in 1974. Now, that very power, that perceived stranglehold on communication and innovation, became its greatest vulnerability. The era of trust-busting had returned with a vengeance, and the colossal corporation, once hailed as indispensable, was now increasingly viewed as a dangerous threat to genuine competition and the very spirit of progress. The ambitious deal faltered, then collapsed. The sheer audacity of the attempted takeover, the blatant attempt to absorb a rival that threatened its dominance, coupled with years of mounting antitrust scrutiny from regulators and lawmakers, proved to be an insurmountable obstacle. The market currents, the shifting winds of technological change, and the unwavering force of government intervention were all converging, pushing against the monolithic giant. The era of unchallenged, absolute dominance was not just drawing to a close, it was being forcibly dismantled by a combination of legal pressure and the relentless march of technological innovation that AT&T could no longer control. Then came the decree, the final, irrevocable judgment. The vast empire, painstakingly built over decades of strategic growth, relentless acquisition, and undeniable innovation, was to be fundamentally cleaved. The colossal AT&T was ordered to be broken into smaller, independent pieces on January 8, 1982, a forced divestiture that sent shockwaves through the halls of corporate power, the floors of the stock exchange, and the everyday lives of millions of Americans who relied on its services for their most basic communication needs. The components, once inextricably bound within the monolithic structure, were now thrust out into the world to forge their own destinies. The legendary Bell Labs, the vast manufacturing arm known as Western Electric, the fiercely localized operating companies, each faced a new, intensely competitive, and rapidly evolving landscape. It was an abrupt, almost brutal, end to an era of unparalleled stability, a forced metamorphosis into an uncertain future where survival depended on agility and innovation, not sheer scale and protected market share. The original AT&T, the monolithic entity that had defined American telecommunications for generations, ceased to exist in its former, formidable glory. It had, in essence, become a victim of its own overwhelming success, its deeply ingrained belief in its own permanence blinding it to the truly transformative power of disruptive competition and the relentless, accelerating march of technological evolution that respected no established order. The company's sheer size, once its greatest asset, became a cumbersome liability in a world increasingly driven by nimble, specialized, and decentralized innovation. The divestiture, which officially took place on January 1, 1984, created 7 new independent Baby Bells, regional operating companies tasked with providing local telephone service, while the new AT&T retained the long-distance business and manufacturing arms. It was a radical experiment in market liberalization, designed to foster competition, spur innovation, and ultimately benefit the consumer. However, the sheer scale of the restructuring, the sudden unleashing of previously captive markets, and the inherent complexities of disentangling such a vast enterprise meant the transition was far from smooth, marked by confusion, technical glitches, and intense competition. The newly independent Baby Bells, such as Bell Atlantic, 9X, and Pacific Telesis, were now forced to compete not only with each other but also with AT&T's long-distance services and emerging cable companies. This sudden exposure to market forces, after decades of operating in a protected, regulated environment, was a profound shock. They had to rapidly develop new business strategies, invest in modernizing their networks, and find ways to differentiate themselves in a suddenly crowded marketplace, a far cry from their previous existence as predictable, state-sanctioned monopolies. Meanwhile, the new AT&T, stripped of its local monopolies, found itself in a precarious position. It had to navigate the fiercely competitive long-distance market, a battleground where rivals like MCI and Sprint were already gaining ground, leveraging new technologies and aggressive pricing. Furthermore, the acquisition of computer maker NCR in 1991, a move echoing its earlier failed ambitions, proved to be a disastrous misstep, draining resources and distracting from its core telecommunications business. This acquisition, driven by a desperate desire to reclaim technological dominance, would prove to be a monumental financial drain. Bell Labs, once the crown jewel of innovation, also began to suffer. Without the protective umbrella of the integrated monopoly, and with the constant pressure to justify its costs in a competitive environment, its research focus shifted. The unfettered pursuit of fundamental science gradually gave way to more applied, market-driven projects. While still a powerhouse, it was no longer the seemingly infinite wellspring of world-changing inventions it once was, its autonomy and funding increasingly constrained by the business realities of the post-divestiture era. The years following the divestiture were a turbulent period of consolidation, mergers, and strategic realignments. The Baby Bells, once fiercely independent, began to merge with each other, driven by the desire to regain economies of scale and national reach. Bell Atlantic merged with 9X in 1997, and SBC Communications, which had acquired Pacific Telesis, eventually acquired AT&T itself in 2005, effectively reversing the divestiture by consolidating the regional monopolies back into a single entity under the iconic AT&T name. The original AT&T, the entity that had entered the 1984 divestiture, struggled to redefine itself in the face of relentless competition and its own strategic blunders. Its attempts to enter the computer market proved disastrous, and its legacy long-distance business faced constant pressure. The company underwent several more significant restructurings and acquisitions, including the controversial takeover of TCI and MediaOne in the late 1990s, aiming to pivot into the burgeoning cable and internet markets. These were desperate, costly gambles, fueled by a fear of obsolescence and a clinging to past glories. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the landscape of telecommunications had been utterly transformed. The internet had become the dominant force, rendering much of AT&T's traditional infrastructure and business model obsolete. Companies that had embraced digital technologies early, like Cisco and later the mobile giants, were now the true titans. AT&T, the company that had once controlled the flow of information, found itself struggling to adapt to a world where information flowed through decentralized, open networks, a stark contrast to the controlled conduits of its past. The relentless pursuit of acquisition and diversification, the attempt to buy its way back to dominance in new technological frontiers, proved incredibly costly. The company amassed significant debt through ventures like its ill-fated acquisition of TCI for $47 billion in 1999, a deal intended to catapult it into the broadband revolution. This massive financial burden, combined with the ongoing challenges in its core businesses and the competitive pressures from emerging technologies, placed the once unassailable giant in a dire financial situation, forcing painful write-downs and asset sales throughout the early 2000s. The original AT&T, the integrated behemoth that had once been synonymous with communication, effectively ceased to exist in its familiar form. While the brand name persisted, the entity that emerged from the turbulent decades of post-divestiture was a very different company, one that had shed vast portions of its historical empire and faced an existential challenge to reinvent itself. It was a stark illustration of how even the most dominant corporations could falter when they failed to adapt to fundamental technological and market shifts, clinging to outdated models of control. The story of AT&T's transformation is not simply one of corporate downfall, but a profound lesson in the cyclical nature of power and innovation. The very technologies fostered in the hallowed halls of Bell Labs, designed to advance communication, ultimately unleashed forces that led to the unbundling of the monopoly. The digital age, born from its own research, proved to be its most formidable disruptor, a testament to how innovation, once unleashed, can transcend the control of its creators and reshape entire industries in ways unforeseen. The relentless pressure to innovate and compete, once AT&T was forced out of its protected monopoly, also led to a series of strategic missteps and costly acquisitions. The company's attempt to acquire TCI for nearly $50 billion in 1999, a move to enter the cable television market, was particularly disastrous. It was a massive overpayment driven by the fear of missing out, and the integration proved immensely difficult, burdening the company with debt and diverting focus from its core telecommunications and nascent internet services, ultimately contributing to significant financial write-downs and a period of deep uncertainty. The divestiture on January 1, 1984, was not just a legal mandate, it was a pivotal moment that unleashed a torrent of competition and technological advancement. The 7 regional Bell operating companies, the Baby Bells, were now free to pursue their own paths, leading to a period of intense innovation in local services and network modernization. Simultaneously, the new AT&T focused on long-distance and equipment, but it was the burgeoning personal computer and internet revolution, driven by companies like Microsoft and Intel, that truly began to redefine communication and information access, largely outside AT&T's initial control. The ambition to control not just communication lines but also the burgeoning digital information age proved to be AT&T's Achilles heel. Its ill-fated acquisition of NCR in 1991, a desperate attempt to build a dominant position in the computer industry, cost billions and yielded little. This followed a pattern of trying to acquire its way back to a dominant position rather than truly innovating organically in these new fields. The sheer weight of these failed acquisitions and the distraction from core competencies severely hampered its ability to adapt to the rapidly changing technological landscape of the 1990s. By the late 1990s, the once invincible AT&T found itself in a desperate fight for relevance. The rise of the internet and mobile communication had rendered much of its traditional infrastructure and business model increasingly obsolete. Its attempts to pivot into broadband and content, notably the $47 billion acquisition of TCI, were enormously expensive and ultimately unsuccessful in securing a leading position. This period was marked by significant debt accumulation, asset write-downs, and a fundamental questioning of the company's strategic direction, a far cry from its days as the undisputed king of telecommunications. The legacy of AT&T's monopoly era, its unparalleled investment in research at Bell Labs, laid the groundwork for the digital revolution. Yet, its subsequent attempts to maintain control through acquisition and rigid structure ultimately proved to be its undoing. The very forces of innovation it helped unleash, amplified by government regulation and market liberalization, dismantled its empire. It's a powerful reminder that while innovation can build empires, a failure to adapt and a thirst for absolute control can just as easily be the architects of their ruin. What began as a revolutionary vision to connect a nation ultimately led to a corporate structure so vast it choked on its own success. AT&T's journey from undisputed titan to a company struggling for its identity serves as a profound case study in the psychology of power, the limits of control, and the unforgiving nature of technological progress. It demonstrates how ambition, when unchecked by adaptability and an understanding of evolving markets, can transform a symbol of progress into a relic of the past. The pursuit of certainty and control, the desire to own every facet of a burgeoning industry, blinded AT&T to the true nature of the coming revolution. They believed they could buy the future, but the future, it turned out, was not for sale to a single buyer. The story of AT&T's empire, its rise, and its eventual fragmentation, is a powerful narrative about the limits of even the greatest power when confronted by the unstoppable tide of innovation. If you spent this video tracing the intricate web of AT&T's rise and fall, and the billions in research and legal battles that defined it, hit like and subscribe for more.